Pray with me. Almighty, all righteous, all merciful Father in heaven, thank you so much for allowing us to gather here and fellowship and learn your word. And dear Lord, please be with those who are weary, whether it be mentally, physically, or spiritually, and put your loving arms around them. Dear Lord, as Steve brings us our lesson tonight, please allow us to open up our hearts and our minds and take in the information that he studied for to give to us. In Jesus' most precious name we pray. Amen.
Well, good evening. My plan is to wrap up our study for Bridging the Testaments tonight, and then next week what we'll do is we'll begin studying the book of Revelation, kind of a high level, finding hope in the book of Revelation. So that'll be a good study. It won't be, sometimes it can be a grind depending on how people deal with it, and hopefully what it turns out to be is more interesting and getting the big picture of what's going on rather than trying to zero in on every little detail and piece, which I don't even think that's how the book is meant to be read. So I don't think that is a super productive study. It's interesting to some extent, but I think better to look at the high level. So that class is a class that's going to be better if you have read the material. Coming into it cold, you're just going to be lost most of the time. You know, one of the things about the book of Revelation is it's this single vision. And if you're not familiar with what's going to happen, what came before and what's coming next, it's a little bit difficult to follow. It's like when someone's telling you their dream or something. It's hard to follow unless you have a little bit of context to it. So I would just encourage you to begin reading that and continue to read it through the course of the study in order to, and it'll also be able to get good questions, good feedback, good observations as we go through and ultimately make the study better. So that's my plan coming up for this next week. This week, we've been talking about the history between the end of the Old Testament, essentially, and the beginning of the New Testament, what's going on in there. We're at about 57 AD, which is 50 years before Jesus is born. So we won't quite get down to where Jesus is born. We won't get to that part of history, but we'll basically cover the rise and fall, or the rise and reign of Herod the Great. But in this time period, what also happens, and maybe this is where we'll pick up, is in between 60 and 49, Rome is in transition. So it is a republic. It's been a republic for probably 600 years at this point, which means instead of being one man having all the power, there are representatives of different areas, and they represent the power of Rome. And that's been very successful for Rome. They've been able to really be a lot more consistent in a lot of ways than these other nations. So we're watching the Seleucids. They're a hot mess. Like every time a king dies, all their treaties die, and they got to fight to figure out who's going to reign. They got to fight to figure out what land they get. They lose their battles and make more treaties, and those treaties last until the king dies. And the Ptolemies is the same way. You kind of have this like back and forth and back and forth. It's just nothing but turmoil and just craziness, like really just craziness. And Seleucid, it's like, if you're swinging a rope and it's long, it seems like it takes a long time, but if you shorten that rope up, it just starts going faster and faster and faster. And that's what it seems like is happening in the Seleucid Empire, where you have longer reigns and they just keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter until it's pretty much as soon as someone comes to power, someone else is raising an army to kill them. So that's what's been going on. Rome brings a level of stability to that. And so a man named Pompey, he conquers in a very similar fashion to Alexander the Great. He is like the hero of Rome. He did this in part by taking advantage. So instead of doing his job, sometimes he'd go for the more glorious win, or he would take the thing that got him more money and more power rather than what actually accomplished his mission. So he kind of worked it a little. But Pompey was really highly recognized, became the richest man in Rome through conquest. They put together, it was Julius Caesar, Pompey, and a guy named Crassus. And they made what was called the first Roman triumvirate. Basically, these three guys held all the power, all the influence. They were pretty much the three richest guys in Rome, and they were able to control what was going on. Out of that triumvirate, what ended up happening is Crassus wanted to conquer the Parthians because they were an enemy of Rome, and he didn't have the kind of glory and victory that Pompey and Julius Caesar had. So he went up there right across the desert, like his troops were about to mutiny on him, and the Parthians just smoked him. Like it was a demoralizing battle loss for Rome. So it was like they compared it to Hannibal when he came across the mountains from Carthage and was able to sneak into Rome and conquer, almost make Rome fall. So it was that kind of a bad victory. So Crassus ends up dying in all that, and Julius Caesar and Pompey, they are at war. Rome's at civil war. Who's going to have the power? So Pompey has a little bit better footing. But Julius Caesar is really smart. He was a general in Gaul for a long time. So he's like trying to fortify, trying to get someone coming in behind Pompey in order to give him fighting on two fronts. So the way he's doing that is he reaches out to Judea. There's a guy, the high priest is John Hyrcanus, and he's a spineless man. He pretty much just does whatever people tell him. It's like, okay, go over here. Okay, like, you know, he just has no will of his own, no personal strength. And another man named Antipater, he's the guy who John Hyrcanus just gave up power, gave up kingship, gave up high priesthood, and permanently what he thought. Then Antipater came and said, "You're not giving it up. Okay, so let's go to Idumea. We're going to raise an army. Okay, so we're going to go fight Jerusalem. Okay, like so that is John Hyrcanus' life, like, or I guess Hyrcanus II. But anyway, that's his life. Okay, I'll do whatever Antipater tells me. Antipater was a pretty shrewd man and a good manager, good at ruling and administration. So he did a good job, and they actually did a pretty good job in Jerusalem together. Julius Caesar reached out to him, but Pompey anticipated it, so he went in there and he basically killed all the people who could take their spot. So kind of eliminated this man named Alexander and his rebellions. He had like 5 rebellions in like 5 years. Like the guy just kept having rebellions, and then they would stop the rebellion and they wouldn't kill him, and so he'd come back again, try again, and they wouldn't kill him. So he did that over and over through this time period. But what you have happening is just Roman civil war. You ever hear the term crossing the Rubicon? So you have this tension, and so Julius Caesar has this choice, right? Either I withdraw because I'm outgunned, or I cross the Rubicon into Rome, and now it's civil war. So that's the decision. So when someone's like, it's like the crossing the Rubicon minute, that was his moment. And from that point, ultimately, Pompey lost. Julius Caesar becomes, basically, he goes into Rome. Rome makes him I can't remember the name, but basically, they make him a tyrant. Like they make it, it's not tyrant. The word is, what do you call it? Dictator. Dictator. That was, they didn't use the same language. And imperator is a name they would give to conquering heroes, like Pompey was imperator. But that it didn't mean the same thing as it does now. So emperor wasn't quite the same word. It meant more victor in battle or hero than empire. The actual name and I can't tell you the Latin name, but I can tell you what the translation is the first of the citizens of Rome. That's actually their title for their, we would call king. And so they would make you the first citizen of Rome, and that means you would be higher than all other citizens, and they'd all have to listen to you. So that would be the actual title conveyed. But that's essentially what he became. They gave emergency power to him for him to make decisions without the Senate, so he could go to war and stop the civil war. So that's what he ends up doing. He ends up gaining power. And then after the Civil War is over, Julius Caesar was very shrewd. So everything he did just slowly over time diminished the power and the influence of the Senate and put him in more power and have more influence, because they were kind of co-regent. Like they were both existing, but he just kept making them more and more useless, while he made himself more and more central to government. So this little cabal of people, they decided he's got too much power. They were already talking about godhood for him, which Rome had never done, but they were going to recognize him as the carnation form of a deity. So there's a little cabal of people, and I can't remember all their names, but they're, you hear on Shakespeare, et tu, Brute, like Brutus. That was one of his friends. But, so you have several of these guys. They all corner him in the where the senators meet and stab him 23 times. So he dies. After he died, like within that year, two things happened. The first thing that happened was there was this comet that was visible during daylight. And so they saw this comet. And so, as Julius Caesar was given the title incarnation of deity, he was the son of a god. So that was kind of one of the titles they were given to him. And then he dies, and in order to demonstrate, they said the comet was, see, this is the Son of God returning to his realm in heaven. So that's what they said the comet was, is Julius Caesar returning. And after that, there was like a really cloudy year. It turns out, somewhere else, 2 volcanoes erupted. And so the whole year was cloudy and cold, and crops were dying. And they said, this is the gods punishing us for killing their son and going against their favor. So it's interesting, just because, this was in like the 40s, but, not long before Jesus died, within memorable history, you had this concept of the Son of a God dying and then ascending. And so, but it's interesting because what he was saying is the Gentiles, with this kind of story backdrop, it would make it a lot more palatable for them to accept the truth of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, him being the Son of a God and some things like that. They said that this kind of put that into their consciousnesses as a concept that they would be more ready to accept because of this historical thing, which I thought was just kind of an interesting element. Is you see, in all this, what we're seeing is God preparing the way for Christ. And although this is kind of a pagan thing, it still plays into the role of preparing the way for Christ, preparing the Gentiles to receive him and to understand him. So that's what's going on. After Julius Caesar dies, one of the things that happened is his right-hand general, his name was Mark Antony, or Antony. And Mark Antony was pretty successful general. And then he also, so Julius Caesar, he spent some time in Egypt, and so he had a son down there with Cleopatra the Seventh. So that son, his name was Caesarion, which means Little Caesars. So if you ever wonder like a shorter name to the pizza place, you should call it Caesarion. And then you see, well, what's a Caesarion section? I don't know why they call it that, but Caesarion means Little Caesar. So, and Caesar was not a title; it was just it was Julius Caesar. Caesar was the last name, and so he was Little Caesar. He was Caesarian Caesar was his name. So anyway, but he was the son of Julius Caesar. So there, you have a little bit of lineage there. But the problem was Romans didn't like Greeks, and so the fact that their ruler had a baby with basically a barbarian type of person, that kid really wouldn't have been good to rule in Rome. So what Caesar did is, as he spotted this young man, his name was Octavian, and Octavian was sharp. So basically, Julius Caesar, he doesn't adopt him, but he writes him into his will, and takes him under his wing, and then sends him off to school to be educated. After Julius Caesar is dead, he retroactively in his will adopted him and then made him heir of all his estate. And Julius Caesar was incredibly wealthy at this point. Not as wealthy as he would become, or he was incredibly wealthy. He was one of the richest men in the world. So Octavian got that. He was 18, and everyone underestimated him. Who's this guy? Mark Antony thought he was going to try and step up and fill the shoes of Julius Caesar. Much more accomplished, much closer with him, obviously knew his strategies and all that. And what Octavian did is he let people underestimate him and just made subtle little moves and made things work in his favor while people were underestimating him. But ultimately, what ended up happening is he was wealthy because he inherited, and they put together another triumvirate, and this was triumvirate. I can't remember all who was in it, but ultimately it broke down again. But Octavian became emperor. And Octavian, he was 18, in his mid-20s he becomes emperor. He's very smart, very good administrator, and also very politically savvy. And so he whittles away even more at the Roman Senate. They were pretty much impotent. So what ended up happening was, after Julius Caesar dies, they thought, the Senate will snap back. But they had been so defanged, they couldn't snap back. There was no elastic left in their snap. So they just kind of didn't do anything. And so Octavian was able to step in, kind of take control of Rome. And over time, he basically became the emperor of Rome. One of the things he did is he also had some, Mark Antony had children down in, he also got involved with Cleopatra, had a bunch of children with her. And so during the Second Roman Civil War, Octavian needed to have a position down in Egypt. So he ends up going to Egypt. They were at war down there, so he used his troops to kind of end their war. And then he took over Egypt. And then he settled things in Jerusalem. We'll get to Jerusalem in a minute. He settled things in Jerusalem. So now Rome literally owns the whole world. And he is the ruler of the world at this point, Octavian. His name became changed to Augustus. So he was Augustus Caesar, is what you would recognize it as. And Augustus is actually a moniker which means pious, like August. That's the idea. Is he was pious, and so he had a good reputation. They gave him this title. He ruled the world. In fact, he kept Egypt as his own. That's my land. So all the money from Egypt went to his bank account, essentially, and which made him one of the richest men who ever lived. Augustus Caesar was one of the richest men who ever lived. And so among the richest men in the nation, Herod actually ranked in there, and his annual salary was 2,000 talents of silver. So, just to remember, the Seleucid Empire, in its power, Rome put tariffs on it, not tariffs, but a treaty of Amicida or whatever. Basically, they had to pay back for the war. and they had to repay 10,000 talents of silver in 10 years or 12 years, and they struggled to do it. So his annual income was more than that. So that just gives you a sense that a whole nation would struggle, but he was so successful, he was able to do that. So that's where we're at with Rome, is we end up with the emperor of Rome. And, you know, what comes of that is what they call Pax Romana, which is the peace, Roman peace. So after Augustus conquers the world, he's able to stabilize it. And then in the time Jesus was born and in the time the church was in its infancy, the world was at peace. There wasn't fighting with the Parthians. There was no fighting among the Roman states. Like, the whole world was at peace and prospering. And it was kind of like this little, like, we've been talking about war for the last 600 or 700 years. And then you have this little, like, window of peace. And in that window of peace, the Lord comes, the church is established, it gets its legs under it, then war comes again, Jerusalem's destroyed, and the whole nation falls apart again. So we have this, like, little window, which they call the Pax Romana. It's about a little less than 100 years of peace before the empire falls again into war. So I just find that's another interesting element to this. So let's swing over to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, you have Antipater and Hyrcanus, and there's this back and forth because Pompey was ruling, and then Pompey lost, and so Antipater had to switch allegiance to Julius Caesar. Well, how do you make that switch? He's like, look, I've always been loyal to Rome, so when Pompey was representing Rome, I'm loyal to him. Now you represent Rome, I'm loyal to you. I'm loyal to you. So Antipater's able to navigate these things. And so he did pretty good on that. Same thing, he was loyal to, I think it was Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And then Octavian comes in, and he had to switch to Octavian. Kind of the same sort of thing happened. So that's going on. And in Jerusalem, it is a little back and forth. There was all these little rebellions, but eventually Antipater kind of stabilizes it. So as he's stabilizing it, Antipater has several sons. The one name you'll recognize of his sons is Herod. So Herod is about 18 years old, and Antipater puts him in charge of Galilee, which is full of rebellion. There's this guy who's kind of like the Maccabee rebellion, where he's going and making Gentiles suffer for being in Israel's land, basically. So, but Herod goes up there, he gets his military, he hunts them down and executes them all. He's very successful. In fact, even the empire commends him for it. But in Jerusalem, they're like, he's doing executions without the Sanhedrin's approval. It looks like he's kind of starting to go outside of, getting out of his lane a little bit. So they didn't like Herod a lot. But in time, Herod, a little bit at a time, getting involved in politics. He's very shrewd, very sharp, but he ends up coming to power, interacting with Rome. Antipater kind of leaves him in good footing. Antipater just dies one day at 70. They don't know if he's poisoned. They suspect it, but they don't know. It really isn't known how Antipater died. But then after Antipater died, Herod essentially made a play for power. He goes and appeals to Augustus, who he had some favor with. Augustus liked him, and he kind of made the same kind of argument his dad did. Look, I'm always loyal to Rome, doesn't matter who. And so he kind of goes through this rant. And what ends up happening, so let me back up a little bit. While Herod was in his 20s, there was this Essene prophet called Menelaus. And he looks at Herod and says, "You're going to be the king of the Jews." Herod didn't take it too seriously. But over time, it's like Herod's path is just kind of moving that direction. So and he gets up to his late 20s, early 30s, and he's on the brink of having control of Jerusalem. And not as a high priest, he doesn't qualify for that, but just as a ruler of Jerusalem, taking over for Antipater. And then what he ends up doing is he makes good with Rome. And because of his involvement with kind of keeping the Judean region under control while the war with Rome, the civil war with Rome, they basically made him a client king of theirs. So Herod ends up becoming king of the Jews. The first, like, he's not in the line of David, and he's got a lot of insecurities and things, but he becomes king of the Jews. They give him the whole, not just his little Judean region, which originally Rome had broken up all of that. He ends up actually conquering more land than the Hasmoneans ever did. And they held as much land as Solomon. So he actually expanded the Jewish empire larger than any other king of the Jews. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of this. But so he gets in there. There's a little back and forth in this time period. But he ends up being pretty successful in there. He ends up getting trade routes, ports, all the things that bring in wealth. And Herod becomes one of the richest rulers in the Roman Empire. Like, he's extremely wealthy, not on the level of Augustus, but extremely wealthy. It says, the acquisitions gave Herod vast revenue streams that, along with tax farming system he employed, made him one of the wealthiest men in the Roman world, enabled him to finance his vast resume of works and benefactions. His personal annual income was a staggering 1,000 to 2,000 talents of silver. With this, he developed an enormous royal court around his person, in addition to wider class of Herodian elite. So in the Bible, when you hear about the Herodians, like the sect of the Herodians, he established that as a group of people who were loyal to him, a sect of Jews that were loyal to him, and so he wouldn't have to, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't like him that much.
Wasn't he the one that wanted to see some miracle or a magic trick from Jesus? He had heard about Jesus and he wanted to see this.
No, so I think that was Herod.
Was it a different Herod?
Was it Herod Antipas? Antipas, yeah, because he was dead at that point during Jesus. Yeah, he was the guy who tried to killed all the babies in Bethlehem. So I think it was Herod Antipas and he was his son who ruled in Galilee, I believe. So Herod, he goes ahead and starts. He kind of establishes his rule, but it says, more than any other single person in history, Herod left his visible imprint on the physical landscape of Palestine with his large-scale building projects. Just as Augustus would later boast of having found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, Herod could have boasted similarly of his own realm. With the employment of architects from both the Greek and Roman traditions and the sheer scale of his projects, Herod visibly integrated his kingdom with the growing Roman Empire, giving local momentum to a notion that a new age, the international age of Augustus and the local age of Herod, had dawned. Among his projects were several palaces, including a new lavish winter quarters built on the Hasmonean estate outside Jericho, which had been damaged in an earthquake in 31 BC. There was an earthquake in 31 BC that was pretty devastating. Like the Essenes and Qumran, there's several people who had problems, including Jerusalem. So I just thought think that's an interesting little tidbit. But he goes through and it talks about all the places he built. And you're just reading this like, how on earth do you have time to do all of this stuff? And because we're talking probably 50 major constructions, like rebuilding cities, rebuilding fortresses. He actually built the city of Caesarea Philippi, which included a port with a seawall that was 500 meters into the ocean. It was actually the first time that hydraulic cement was used, where they're pouring concrete into the water and it's setting up at the bottom. The way it was built and shaped, the sea currents cleaned the silt out, so that it was basically a self-cleaning, like it didn't actually build up silt as ships were coming in and out. It was basically the harbor was the equivalent of the harbor at Alexandria, which was one of the largest ports on earth. And so you have that. I think it was the same Herod. Remember the one whose guts came out? The voice of a god, not of a man. The little theater they were in where that happened, Herod built. He built. You read about what he built, and he just. It's like just beyond what you could imagine, because also it was massive works. As I read through, I won't read it all, but it's like he built fortresses throughout his kingdom to ensure law and order, especially along trade routes. Herod transformed several cities in monumental ways. Like when you start reading this, so in 20 BC, I'll read this to you because this is super interesting. No, that's about Caesarea Philippi. That's interesting, but I won't read it to you. All right, Herod's biggest contribution to Judaism and his grandest project by far, so he did all these things, but this is the grandest project by far, was a complete renovation of the temple complex in Jerusalem. Planning for it began in 19 BC and involved hiring Egyptian, Greek, and Roman architects, surveying the site, producing plans, securing building materials, employing the workforce, and timetabling construction around the continued operation of the sacrificial cult. It also required the training of about 1,000 priests in construction labor, since they alone were permitted to build the sanctuary and the court of the priests surrounding it. Actual construction began in 16 BC. The first construction phase required the dismantling and replacement of the existing sanctuary. This was completed in 18 months and dedicated with great fanfare and sacrifice in 14 BC. The rest of the inner complex was completed some 6 years later by 8 BC. So that would be just a couple of years before Jesus is born, 8 BC. And so when Jesus went to the temple, it was not the footprint that we see in the pictures with like the portico of Solomon and all that. That came later. It would actually have been just the temple complex that had been rebuilt at that point. But it would be brand new. And one of the things they're saying is the temple was 50 meters high, like the temple, which is 12 stories. 100, I think 100 and some feet, but 12 stories high. Just to give you a concept of it, of all white marble, and the front of it was covered over with gold leaf. And they said if you were standing in front of it in the morning when the sun was rising, it was so bright and reflective you couldn't look at it. So you think about like the glory of God and when the apostle said, "Look at the buildings. Look how beautiful they are." And Jesus said, "Not one stone will be left on another." Imagine the impact when you're looking at something with this kind of grandeur. And people like Augustus Caesar was also an extraordinary builder. But one guy comments, "You haven't seen a beautiful building if you haven't been to Jerusalem." Like this was like worldwide the best.
And if I remember right, the so-called stones that the temple was built out of were the size of boxcars.
Yeah,
They were huge.
Yeah, I'll get to that. In fact, this is really interesting as well. So, getting to the platforms, the temple platform. So, so Herod raised and extended the roughly rectangular footprint of the precinct to over 36 square acres. So when you look at that temple, you're like, how big is that? Okay, it's 36 acres. So the place where Mason and I go play airsoft, it's about 30 acres. And it's a big area. To get from one side of the other, it takes a little bit of time. And at the end of the day, we've gone several miles just going back and forth. And but to think, that's the scale. It's not like the size of a big building or a city block. We're talking 36 acres. That's the size of the platform. It was 480 meters by 300 meters. So that's, to me, it's just like scale-wise, it's just enormous. So he enlarged it to that size, almost doubling the size of the previous precinct. By means of comparison, this was slightly larger than the Roman Forum combined with all the temples and buildings that lined it. All the temples on the Capitoline Hill and the adjacent forums of Julius Caesar's and of Augustine. So you say, okay, the Forum, the temples, the Caesar's palace, like all of that is the same size as this. And then he says, here's another comparison. The entire Acropolis of Athens, so that's where Paul did his sermon on Mars Hills, was 14 acres. That's the Acropolis. This is 36 acres like that, so it just, stunts it. So on the north side, Herod extended the complex outwards toward the recently developed Antonia Fortress, which is named after Antonia Fortress. It's named after Mark Antony. Mark Antony, not Anthony, Antony. And so Antonia Fortress is actually in memory of Mark Antony. I don't know if you knew that. I didn't know that. So, the southern and western portions were also extended, requiring a huge amount of earth-moving work. The construction of the underground vaulting and the erection of the retaining walls up to 10 stories high. These outer walls were composed of colossal limestones, ashlars, weighing between 200 and 300 tons each. The sheer scale of the work undertaken without the benefit of modern machinery is staggering, accentuated by the fact that the entire platform is still the largest retained platform on Earth to this day. So, you stop and think, okay, what did he do there? It's still the largest retained platform. He basically built a mountain. That's what's going on there, is he basically built a mountain. The precinct was reached by bridges, tunnels, stairways leading from various locations in and around the city. All portals led to the expansive court of the Gentiles, whose vast floors were tiled with colorful patterned mosaics. Several ritual baths for worshipers were probably located there. So the ritual baths is where likely the first Christians were baptized. They were probably going into these ritual baths. They were basically a pool that you could walk through. And so they would just be going in there and baptizing people. So that's, and this is in the court of the Gentiles, which you also think about when Jesus when Jesus cleansed the temple and they had all that trade going on. So now you think 36 acres. I bet our fairgrounds is probably around that size. And so you imagine, okay, go to the fairground. There's all sorts of stuff going on there, but they were selling animals in this court of the Gentiles, and so that's what Jesus is chasing off. So it's also to me, I think about this room full of animals. Well, I could chase those animals off, but you think about the fairground. Let's go get the animals out of the fairground, guys. That's a whole other kind of deal there. So
He did have a whip.
he did have. I mean, you would need one, right? You might need a horse too. Chase them out of there. So the outer court was open to people of the ethnicity, which demonstrates Judaism had gained appeal among the more philosophically and conservatively minded Greco-Roman society. It was here that the God-fearers could pray. It also demonstrated something of Herod's own personal syncretism as someone who had one foot both in the Jewish and Gentile world, and who brought to bear which was brought to bear upon the temple architecture. So here's one last little piece. It says the sanctuary itself rose to a height of almost 50 meters, 100 cubits or 16 stories is what it is, and was constructed of polished white marble with the front eastern face decorated with gold leaf. According to Josephus, who had been an eyewitness of the temple, if one looked at the front of the sanctuary in early morning when the sun was in the east, the gleam off the marble and the gold was so intense that it was difficult to look at directly. The temple's grandeur reflected the sacredness of the place, the opulence of Herod, and the desire to integrate the Jewish nation into the Roman world. The effect of the whole was so marvelous that even Herod's detractors were awestruck by it, claiming, "Whoever has not been to Herod's temple has never seen a beautiful building in his life." Jesus' own disciples are said to have drawn Jesus' attention to the grandeur, which prompted his prediction of its destruction. So anyway, I just find that interesting. You see this temple built, and the interesting thing is so from 19 is when it started, and when Jesus is saying, "I'm going to tear down this temple and rebuild it in 3 days," And they say this temple took 46 years to build. So now we have ourselves a little bit of a way to judge what year was it. If they say, okay, well, started in 16, that would put it at 29. If you started in 19, it would put you at 27. So that gives us a pretty accurate range of when Jesus' ministry was happening. So that's one way to tell. So, but when Jesus, it's interesting because Jesus comes to earth, there's this magnificent temple. And you think about the temple, but what was Jesus? This is, John chapter 1, I think, verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but the word dwelt is tabernacled. And really the concept is Jesus is the tabernacle. And so you look at this, like, if you haven't seen the temple in Jerusalem, you haven't seen a beautiful building. And then Jesus said something greater than the temple is here. And you stop and think about that is, how can something be greater than that? That platform is still the greatest thing of its type built ever by people. And yet Jesus said something greater than the temple is here. And you start thinking about, what does that mean? What is Jesus communicating to us? When we say something greater than the temple is here, it's like you got to stop and think, like, that's pretty amazing. But Jesus was better than that. And sometimes we might say, oh, we feel small and insignificant, and like there's not a lot we can do to serve the Lord. But what Scripture says is not our power, but His power that works in us. And you think, what does that mean for us and our ability? And also you stop and think is now Jesus is building His own temple. And you say, what can man do? Herod probably basically met the pinnacle of what man is capable to do, because even now we can't move 300-ton blocks like Herod moved them. Like, we just don't know how, and probably even if you had equipment, it would be very difficult to accomplish what he accomplished. And yet now in 1 Peter chapter 2, he's like, you are the stones that are being built up into a new, maybe that's Ephesians 2. What was that? Is it Peter? I think.
It does talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're living stones in Peter. That's 1 Peter 2. I think Ephesians 2, it talks about being built into a temple of God or something. But those two concepts are wrapped up in Scripture, and that's what we are. And so what is that temple going to look like? If what man can accomplish was so grand, what is it going to look like when we see what Jesus has accomplished? And you say, well, what does that mean? And really what it is the work Jesus has accomplished when a life is reformed and made holy again by following Jesus. That is, as I said, you haven't seen something beautiful unless you've seen Jesus transform a life. Right? That would be the saying, is you haven't seen beauty unless you've seen Jesus transform a life, unless you've seen the building Jesus built, unless you've observed the glory of God. You know, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw His glory. Glory as of the only begotten of the Son, born of the Father. So you just see that concept wrapped up in this. And so when we talk about the temple, we see what's going on here. You know, like Jesus said, not one stone left on another. But that's all right, because I'm going to rebuild it in 3 days, and it's going to be something better than what we have now. And so you really see this claim. When you put it in context, think about the claim Jesus was making and how outrageous it sounds to say something like that unless you were the Son of God. So that's the temple. So let's talk a little bit about, kind of wrap up. So Herod from what I understand, he really was in love with his second wife. Her name was Miriam. His first wife, Doris, basically, I don't know, I didn't say much about marrying her, but he divorced her so he can marry Miriam. Miriam, he really liked and was jealous over. And she was Hasmonean, so she was related to both Hasmonean families. And he thought, okay, if I'm going to be a legitimate king, my heir needs to have Hasmonean blood in order to be able to have legitimacy. So Herod, when he went to go negotiate with Augustus, he didn't know if he was going to come back. So he left orders with the servants that looked after his wife, if I don't come back, kill her. Because he loved her so much, and he couldn't stand the thought of her going and becoming some other man's wife. So he leaves these secret orders, if I don't come back, kill her. And apparently, he did that multiple times through the course of their marriage. And then something happened.
Well, love is blind,
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. Yes, he had some issues. Herod had issues. So something happened, and I can't recall what it was, but he did something, and it made his wife realize he's not a good guy. And then she finds out somehow that he had been leaving orders with her servants to execute her if he dies. And so she's really angry about that. And so what ends up happening with Herod is he doesn't like her, but she's the queen, so he can't just divorce her because she's titled. So he ends up having this he would do something and feel really remorseful about it, and then he would have a building project. And then he ended up executing her, actually, because something happened and he felt like he couldn't get it right. So he executed her, married someone else, and ends up kind of going through this pattern where they actually said, because Herod was a practicing Jew, and they said it would be safer to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son. Because he killed several of his sons who he thought was there's a movie I grew up watching called Major Payne, and the little boy goes to give him a hug, and he spins him around, and he's like, "You plotting on me, boy?" That's kind of what I think about Herod, is thinking that all his sons are plotting on him, trying to and some of them were just doing something innocuous. It just looked bad. Herod was sick, and so someone went and took care of some business while Herod was sick, and he's like, "Nope, kill him." We're not going to have that. And so he ends up having this thing. So, but he would go through times of depression because he'd kill some people and he would regret it later. And then he would be depressed and he would build something. It's kind of like penance. So he's building temples to the Caesar. And what was that? Oh yeah. He kind of had this off and on. But he was a bad guy. And as he got older, he got more and more paranoid. You also know that, okay, he's the king of the Jews. But we see this when Jesus is born. How's he acting? And so that's why this is relevant, is you see Herod killing his favorite wife. And then he finds another one that he loves. He ends up killing her too. And he's killing his kids that he thinks are plotting on him. And he just is pretty brutal. And as he goes along, he gets more and more paranoid. So then he's more and more proactively protecting his position and stuff, killing more people. So so it gets pretty bad.
And he wanted to go see the new king. He told the wise men, "Tell me where I can go see the new king, because I want to go see him.
Yeah.
Visit. And worship him too."
Yeah. Well, because he was the king of the Jews. But now there's this other guy who's born king of the Jews.
Somehow he wasn't being truthful.
Yeah, well, I think they said he was deceiving them. Yeah, but he kind of deceived them, wanted to go worship, because he wanted to kill him, right? He was going to go when he couldn't kill him, what did he do? What was second best? Just kill everyone every boy under under 2 years old kill him in that town. So you think, well, what kind of guy does that? Well, the kind of guy that does that to his favorite wife and to his children and to other people that he thinks is plotting on him, like he's gonna kill him. So here's the story of the death of Herod. He was sick, and he had kind of gotten to bad reputation because he had just been so bad. Like, he got more and more paranoid and killed more and more people. He knew the end was coming. So he went and rounded up every leading man in the city of Jerusalem, brought him into one, I don't know if it was not a Colosseum, but I imagine like a Colosseum-like structure, like a big structure, and had his soldiers in there and said, okay, when I die, slaughter them all. And it was like 800 men. Because he wanted Jerusalem to cry when he died. He wanted them to mourn. And so the way he was going to get that is by killing all the men in Jerusalem, And what ended up happening is the soldiers just didn't obey his orders after he died because he was dead. So everyone was rejoicing over that. But, you kind of see this. But, another aspect of Herod is he actually really tried to bring up parallels between him and David. And so you say, okay, what did David do? Well, he when he rose to the throne, his son built the temple, but essentially, the temple was built and as a keep a promise to David, so he built the temple. And David conquered a bunch of land, he conquered a bunch of land, and he came from the same region that David came from, and so he was really trying to build his image up to be in the image of David, but also, the temple was kind of a part of accomplishing that. It's just really interesting to me how all these things came about. But you see what this kind of guy was like. But he was king of the Jews, but almost in like a kind of the same as King Saul was to King David. Saul was basically the king that men would choose, and what he would become, and then David was the king God chose. You kind of have a little bit of a contrast even in Jesus and Herod, because both of them called king of the Jews. But Herod he had all of men's greatest accomplishments, and he was really a reflection of men. And then you see Jesus, what was his? I mean, in a lot of ways, you could probably compare what Jesus claimed to do, like not physically, but in his work, compared to what Herod did in his work, built things up and restored things and rose to power and all these things. But, as you really kind of see a concept of what does God want from his servants? And you really see that aspect. But as we look at all this in kind of a big picture, we've seen through time God bringing about Christ. And it just seems to me like, it's not a straight line. It is a scribble, right? Like the whole history we've learned here is just a scribble. Trying to return, building the little tiny temple, trying to establish a city, but kind of get knocked down over and over again. But each time they get back up and they keep going forward and they keep doing things, you see this really grand prophecy in Daniel and the fulfillment through various kingdoms. And to me, I think this concept actually is really important for understanding Revelation, is when you see kingdoms ebbing and flowing on earth, you need to understand that is how God works. Like God causes that to happen. And you think, how on earth can someone cause a kingdom to rise and fall? Like, how do you, think of how many moving parts would be, how complicated a mechanism to raise up and to cause to fall a kingdom. Individual people, and how do you influence all that? But what we're seeing in this, and you see utter chaos and basically men ruling in this time period, ruled by their whatever lust and whatever desire for power and whatever heartlessness and whatever, they're assassinating each other, taking advantage of one another and all these. You see this time period, really men ruling But in that, God got the world where it needed to be in order to bring forth Jesus. And when we read Revelation, you're going to see that exact same thing. And I'm guessing, I haven't read it in that way, but I think probably after this study, reading through Revelation, there's a few things brought up in Revelation. For instance, we talked about Julius Caesar's comet and then the cloud. Revelation 9 talks about a comet falling from the sky, and then the clouds coming and darkening out the sky. And you see kind of a concept there that would mirror would be the antithesis of, they thought, oh, that comet represents him ascending, but in this one, it's all falling in, and it represents a kingdom in war and turmoil. So you kind of see interesting parallels. And there's several of those things as you go through this. You guys say, wait a minute, there's a lot of parallels here that you see as kind of recognizable in this history, but what you're really seeing is God's in control. It's almost like Daniel gave us a peek behind the curtain to see God working in history, his ability to foretell how this chaos would turn out. And then in Revelation, what you see is actually where we'll start is because God says, come up here. John goes up to heaven. So he's up in heaven, he sees God's throne room, and all of a sudden he sees things being sent to earth from heaven, and earth is responding to it. And what you see is, well, how does God control the earth? What form does it take? And you see from heaven's view how God gets his work done on earth. And then after chapter 12, John's on earth. And he's seeing things happen on earth. The sea's moving, creatures are coming out of the sea, false prophets are arising and falling. And it looks like Satan is absolutely in control. But nothing happens until God blows a trumpet or pours out a bowl. And then the next step happens. And then God gives his next command. And the next thing happens. And it's all orchestrated by God. And so when you say, well, what's the hope in Revelation? Like, you reread this history, it's a little depressing. It really is a depressing history because it's like it doesn't have a happy ending. Nothing really ends good. Like, even if something goes good, it's like for this very short period of time and it's still a little messed up. And you say, okay, well, where's the good in this? Well, the good is that God's in control of it. God is the one who causes these things to take place in their time and in the way that he wants it to happen. And ultimately, we can trust him to bring us through it, however it turns out. And that's really a hopeful message that you see in that. So, we'll tie these two thoughts together. We're kind of looking at this period of time before. Revelation looks at kind of like the period of time that follows the life and ministry of Jesus in the beginning of the church. And they really bookend each other pretty well around Jesus and his cross. So, any questions, thoughts, comments? All right, let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Our most gracious God and Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you so much for us being able to study these things and to go through this history and ultimately, Lord, to see your power and your wisdom to be able to work and influence history and to cause things to go about in a way that you would have them to be. Like, even though we look at it and it just looks like utter chaos, dear Lord, but there is an order that you put there and that you arranged ahead of time, and however you work, Lord, you brought these things about. And we thank you so much that we have a God like you who's all-powerful and wise, and that we can have your protection and your guidance through our own lives. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.